Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm Nicole and we're going to be making a skeleton bog dragon. I got this idea after seeing Zan Von Zed's amazing gothic dark pawns, and I was like, but what if we made it a dragon? And I saw this awesome artwork. I wish I knew how to say their name, but I don't. It looks like it's a couple that makes these awesome D&D maps and pictures. Of course, I'm inspired by one of my favorite books, The Hobbit, with Smaug the dragon and that cool bog in Lord of the Rings. So I started off with a sketch that I made. Now we can get to the clay. My secret weapon for this build is going to be glass. This is going to allow me to sculpt on top so I can keep everything to scale and get all the pieces that I need, and it is going to be many pieces. I'm starting off with the tiny little teeth, and for the sharp pointy finger things, don't know what they're called. There's going to be a lot of made up words in this video and made up anatomy, so just brace yourself. I want this dragon to look very scary and very cool, and that means horns, big ones, all shapes and sizes. I didn't exactly know what I was looking for, so I just sculpted a bunch and figured the more the merrier. That way I can pick and choose what I want. And of course, I'm texturing it all with my toothbrush of texture and then putting all my pieces together so I don't lose them. Using my sketch underneath as a guide, I just start adding layers. Now it's a little tricky taking something from a sketch to a 3D thing, and that is where using lots and lots of references will come in very handy. Definite ugly stage going on here, but I'm just trying to work through it. For the horns, I just played around with it until I felt like it looked right. I'm locking it all in with some liquid clay adhesive and adding clay where I need to so everything's structurally sound. Once I figured out the basic shape, I could then start working on beefing it out and making it look more realistic. I added a nice little brow ridge right here to make them look a little more scary. Then I could start adding some texture with my tools and making some holes to fit all of those tiny teeth into. I made sure to use liquid clay adhesive on every single tooth so that none would fall out. I took a lot of time positioning these exactly how I liked, but he needed a little bit of a lip around that area to hold the teeth in. And of course, I'm adding more detail. Is this right? I don't know, because I'm making this up as I go along. I use my needle tool to get those little cracks that you see in skeletons. Do dragon skeletons have these? Who knows? The vertebrae were surprisingly tricky. I had to try out a few methods to figure out what would work. I made a ton of tiny balls of clay. That way my vertebrae would be around the same size and I could taper them up or down with everything looking cohesive. My blades really helped me square everything up. As I was detailing these, they started to look familiar, and I figured out that they look like little owl faces. Just wait. Little tiny owl faces. Aren't they adorable? I'm gonna remember this the next time I need to make an owl. After baking all of my little owl face vertebrae, I realized I was really gonna have a challenge trying to keep them all organized, and that I was gonna need to make so many more. So on to making the tiniest of little owl vertebrae, and then even tinier. After baking all these vertebrae, I knew I had to organize them into sections so that I knew what went where, and it was challenging. I used some upside down tape to stick the main neck and vertebrae section of the body to the tape. That way I knew roughly where everything went. Now for more made up anatomy with Nicole, these are shoulder blades, I guess. I just made what looked cool, and then I bent them so that later they would fit over the ribs more three-dimensionally and not be flat. The arm bones, luckily, were a lot more straightforward, just the typical bone shape. Now this dragon, I want it to appear really huge, and I'm guessing if something huge fell out of the sky, it would break some bones. So after adding some detail, we're gonna break them bones. You know I love detail, so of course after breaking the bones, I'm gonna detail the inside of the bone area because I can. Is anybody gonna see this? Probably not, but I had to. For almost everything I make, I always look at references. They are so helpful. And yes, different skeletons were different, but I could kind of pick and choose and get an idea of what to make. For the arm bones of this dragon, I tried to kind of mimic our own arm bones where we have those two bones that stick together. It made it look a lot more realistic. And once again, I'm making this up and just trying to make it look somewhat right. There comes a time in every sculpt that I do where I'm like, can I pull this off? And once I had these arm bones done, I was like, we can do this. Let's go. So go I did. I gave him some spiky little fingers because who doesn't want super sharp, cool looking thumbs? I mean, come on now. For the tail, I did not like my original sketch, so I redid it. And just a reminder, I don't show every mistake I make in my videos, but believe me, I make them. Don't worry about it, keep going, try again. I was loving this new tail, but of course I was like, we need more. Because you know what we don't have enough of? Skeleton pieces. So of course I made an extra piece to go on top of the tail, so it looks extra awesome. With my tail appropriately textured, I could move on to the hip bones. I can't even tell you what I was doing because I had no idea. This is 100% winging it and just trying to make it look tough and cool and spiky. I don't know what's happening here, you guys. Just texture it and do some magic and hope it looks okay. I've eaten enough chicken thighs in my life to know what a thigh bone should probably look like. Who knows? But I knew the socket was important because that has to fit into the hip joint. So I of course made that and then just textured it. With my battle damage complete, I moved on to the femurs, I guess this would be. Look, I don't know human anatomy, so I sure as heck don't know dragon anatomy. But it felt right, so I just went with it. The same technique I basically used on the arms, but I made it smaller and just changed some of the shape. Don't know what this bone is, but a lot of the references I saw used it, so I stuck that in there and was like, yeah, that works. For the little tootsie bones, I just went ahead and made a lot of little tiny bones. Aren't they cute? I went ahead and textured all of them, which was tricky because they turned into little jumping beans, and then poked a little hole where they would fit together. I don't know. Just let your heart guide you. I had some extra teeth and those made the perfect claws. Using my liquid clay adhesive, I stick that in the hole, put my little tooth in, bam, little claw, nailed it. Keeping track of all these little bone pieces became a full-time job. So to the tape, the little tootsies went, because I would never figure out how to put them together again. The wing pieces were the easiest pieces to do. I guess these would be the fingers if it were like a bat, you know what I mean. My biggest piece of advice for these is do not bend them. Bones do not go in a arch shape unless it's like a rib. All the bones in the wings should be straight. If you bend them, it's weird. I at least know that that's not how that works, you know? Scraping off the bones from the glass is so satisfying. 10 out of 10, loved it. Keeping track of the bones, after you do that, not so much. I want to try another technique from Zan Von Zed's video where they take old crumbly clay and they just break it up and it makes the coolest rocks. Love it. We'll definitely do it again. I started planning out my little bog plant islands, and you may be thinking, Nicole, where are the ribs? Your dragon has no ribs. Don't worry, I do figure it out eventually. But right now, I'm lost in the bog, making my little bog islands. The key part to making these little bog islands is that I want it to look like a real bog, but not cover up our skeleton that we just spent hours and hours creating. I textured them, even though I'm going to cover them with static grass, because my brain told me to. Here, they did stick to the paper, which I kind of had a feeling would happen, but I didn't have a big enough piece of glass to sculpt on top of my sketch. But I just soaked them in water and spent a million years taking all the paper off. I got started on the ribs after I realized that my dragon was ribless, which is not going to work. I wanted these to be three-dimensional and stick up out of the bog a bit. So I shaped them into a rib shape and then kind of pushed the clay together to give it that 3D effect. I made sure to leave space between both sets of ribs so that I could add the vertebrae in later. Lots of texturing and detail. I added some cracked ribs in there too, so that we can add a fun detail to that later. Most polymer clay loves to stick to glass, so I used that to my advantage to help hold them in that arched posture that I wanted them in. And now, we finally have all of the bones for this dragon. I wanted to make some giant arrows that are going to be poking out through the back of the ribs. I took a regular toothpick and whittled it down to a tiny little point. I also made a tiny little arrow, and this is going to go in the dragon's eye. And you can see making the little feather bit for this was extremely tedious. I'm using Cos clay, so I don't have to worry about something like this being fragile and breaking. My inspiration for all of these giant arrows that are shot through the dragon is from The Hobbit, when Bard shoots Smaug through the chest with that special arrow. Now that I know that it looks right, we can move on to our containment unit. And our containment unit is just a wooden plaque I bought from Michael's and painted with a mixture 50-50 of black and brown. This is going to help it blend into the bog and not distract from the main piece, but also hold in all the resin. All of these skeleton pieces, I have to remember where to put them, and that's where my poor, tattered drawing comes into play. I'm going to trace along the back and then trace over the design again to transfer it into our containment unit. With the sketch transferred, I can start adding all of the bones. I'm going to be using this glue, but you can use whatever glue you like. Putting all these bones down kind of felt like a puzzle, and it was really fun to see it start coming together. Was it tedious? Yes. Do I know how to make anything that's not tedious? No. To keep this skeleton looking more three-dimensional, I added epoxy clay underneath the vertebrae that the ribs are under. This makes it stick out of our bog and looks a lot more realistic and not so flat. I tapered the clay so that the spine kind of tapered into the wood layer. And this is where I was super thankful that I organized all of my pieces accordingly. I did end up changing the position of some of the bones during this, and it did kind of mess up my bog layout later, but I fixed it and I'll show you how I did that. But you may need to change up your positioning on the fly to get it exactly how you want it to look. My art tweezers came in super handy for all of those tiny little vertebrae I had to add. Adding some curve to the shoulder blades worked out really well, and it fit over the rib cage very nicely. And if you're wondering why I just didn't put a layer of resin and then put the pieces on, I could have done that, but they may have moved. Resin tends to make things float, which can make it very tricky, so I prefer to just glue things down before the resin gets involved. Using the same color I used on the containment unit, I paint over my sketch and all the bones and any glue or epoxy that may be showing so everything blends together. My bog pieces get the same treatment, and then I do another technique that I learned from Zam Von Zed's video. They use Mod Podge and paint. I added a little water, mix it together, then add in the rocks that we made earlier, mix it all together to make a little rock soup, and then spread that soup all over the surface. The glue and paint helps stick it to the surface so that it doesn't move around, which is perfect when working with resin. For the paint, I'm using a dry brush method. I'm using different color greens and just layering them on so that the background is a little more interesting. I dry brush my rocks so that you can actually see them. Key to a good paint job is always adding multiple colors. I'm starting off with a tan, moving on to a vintage white, and just a touch of true bright white to bring out the skeleton and all of the detail. I wanted to incorporate some type of treasure with this dragon. Every good dragon needs a treasure hoard, but how was I going to make treasure that looked small enough for how big this dragon was supposed to be? And the only idea I came up with was using glitter. Glitter in the color of treasure. So I used golds, some red for ruby, amethyst, emeralds, and then I mixed it into some resin. Now in The Hobbit, it said that Smaug laid in the treasure for so long that it became stuck to his body, almost like a second skin, and that was the effect I was going for. I wanted it to look like it hit the bog and the treasure that was on its body just kind of sprayed everywhere and sunk into the bog. I use a paintbrush for this and just paint it into all the places I want it to be. I set a little resin aside and filled it with red glitter to put specifically the eye to give it a really cool like red eye effect. My paint markers came in really handy for painting the tiny arrow and spears that I made. They're also very hard to hold on to. I just went with a classic metallic silver. Painting this tiny was very challenging, and of course I had to add a tiny little detail on that arrow, because why not, and stuck it right in the resin as I was curing. Once all the battle damage was attached, I went ahead and covered my resin with a lid. This is going to help all of the pet hair that's floating around in my house, thanks to Jenny, not get into my resin. Also, don't use your fingers to see if your resin is cured. That's dumb. What's not dumb is making sure you always wear the proper PPE when working with resins of any kind. Here I'm mixing up my final layer of resin, which is going to be our bog water. And bog water needs to look weird. It needs to be funky. Now, I am a little sad that once I added it, it didn't really show up, but at least in my heart, I knew it was properly colored. The nemesis of anybody working with resin is always going to be bubbles. Pesky, giant bubbles that stick to things, which I attack with a paintbrush to pop. I wanted to add a little variation to our bog, and I could not find anything in Michael's, but when I was walking out, I saw some grass. Some dead grass that was just hanging out, so I ripped it out of the ground and put it in my car and drove off, because anything can be an art supply if you're weird enough. I used a needle tool to poke some holes that I could stick my grass into, and bam, tiny tree / bush / whatever. With our resin cured that I definitely didn't touch with my finger, we can start adding our bog layer. I made a few changes as I was positioning the skeleton, which meant that some of my bog pieces did not fit, but that's okay because an X-Acto can fix that. I shaped them up, chopped them up, and got them set in a way that I liked. Then I could glue them all down. Gluing them down was a little tricky and they tried to pop up, but I eventually got them stuck down. And since my bog pieces weren't perfectly straight, it left a gap where they connected to the frame. And that just was not gonna do. So after I had everything glued down, I went ahead and mixed up some epoxy sculpt and just filled in all of the gaps and painted over all of the areas I had to fix. Now, to be honest, you probably would not even see this underneath the static grass, but my brain just would not let it be. So I went ahead and fixed all of it so it's nice and perfect. And every bog needs some grass / trees / bushes that you steal from a Michael's parking lot. Of course, using super glue to adhere them to the little floaty things. And I am so sorry if you came here for a super professional tutorial, because I am many things, but professional I am not. Ah, static grass and our love-hate relationship where every time I use it, I end up electrocuting myself just a little bit. Unfortunately, the best way to do this was to go one little tiny island at a time. So I would paint them, then do the static grass, and repeat a billion times. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe and like and comment, and I will see you guys in the next one.